Sometimes when I walk into the studio, I like to just sit here for a moment with the lights off before I turn on the camera, the machine, the music, and just focus my thoughts on what we're going to do today, what I'm going to do today. Enjoy this creative space that I have and just really center myself for what I intend to do for the day. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll turn everything on. So what we're going to do today is start a new series called Longarming101. I have been teaching for quite a while. I started quilting myself in 1991, and I've had a long arm machine for probably 20 years. But one of the new things is learning how to do video editing, taping, uploading. So that's been kind of a learning curve. So we're going to take a step back and go back to the beginning again and start teaching long arm class just for beginners, basic information to help people get started with their new long arm machine, maybe help people make a decision if they want a long arm machine, what kind of features they want in a long arm machine. As you can see, I have a Bernina Q24 here in my studio, and I'm going to just go over some of the basic elements of the frame and the machine so that we have a vocabulary to start with, and then we're going to build on that as the weeks go on. Later we'll be talking about how to load a quilt, how to use the Pantograph grids, how to load a pantograph, the difference between sewing a pantograph and working on the front of the machine, probably touch a little bit on ruler work, and some of the other components of using a long arm machine. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and by we I mean me, since I'm the cameraman, the editor, and the educator, I guess, in this case. So let's get the camera set up for lesson number 1. I'm just going to do a quick pan around the room just to show you how I have my studio set up. In this little alcove with the windows, I have my Bernina sewing machine set up on a Horn of America sewing cabinet. That's a really bright spot in there for me to sew, and light is a really key component of a sewing studio. Many of you may not know, but for every 10 years of age progression, we need to double the amount of light we have in a room to be able to see for task purposes. Over here is a place that I use a lot for filming some of the laser cut applique videos and also some piecing videos. But I'd like to point out that my ironing board is not an ironing board from a local Walmart or something. This is a Husky workbench, and it has the appropriate height for me, and it's very solid. I could get up and sit on that and the table's not going to collapse. And I have had in the past an ironing board collapse because of the weight of a lot of fabric on it. So that's why I use professional, in this case, what would be generally considered men's tools, workbench, which is never going to fail. Over here we see I have a couple more windows that access a lot of light for me, and I have my Bernina Q24 system set up on their largest frame, a 13-foot frame. And you also see I have a lot of the samples for the applique Elementz laser cut applique. If we start back it this way and move in the opposite direction, again you see my little sewing alcove. I have an exit there, and I hope you'll notice that there's a fire extinguisher in my studio. Actually, there are 2. I have a lot of really expensive equipment in here, a lot of electronics, and I would not want to be without a fire extinguisher within easy access. The stove actually was original to the property, so that stayed. and I have some shelving there for some miscellaneous items. If you can see just past the window, I have ruler storage on the wall, and again another Husky toolbox that houses a lot of thread and quilting tools. And then I have a built-in cabinet, and you'll see here I have another Husky rolling tool cart. I like to have this one right by the machine to hold my pens or rulers that I might be using. You'll see on there 2 different sizes of the Pantograph grids from Elementz, and some ruler storage on the side there. Those particular rulers are from White Arbor Quilting. But here you get a pretty good view of the whole sewing machine and its setup. And now we're going to go over some of the basic components of the frame, and then we'll move to the machine. This is the head of the machine, and you can see it glides beautifully on the framing system. I'm going to go ahead and move that out of the way while we talk about the frame itself. The frame is specific to a Bernina, but there are many of these components that are going to be the same on just about any kind of long arm system. You have here the dead bar. The dead bar never really moves. It holds the quilt down against the quilting surface, holds the quilt down this way so that it's not bouncing. The bar has a very specific height positioning, and you want both the ruler table and the quilt to be able to slide underneath that, but you don't want it so high that the quilt is elevated in the back. If the quilt is elevated in the back, if you are doing ruler work, the ruler can then get caught underneath the hopping foot where the needle would hit it, and it could break the needle, it could break the ruler, it could mess up the timing of the machine. So the positioning of the dead bar is very important, and we can talk about that a little bit later when we actually have a quilt on the machine. This is your take-up lever. The take-up lever is where the quilt will roll up as it's being finished quilting, for the most part. Sometimes we'll go ahead and pre-based components of the quilt and we'll roll it back and forth as we're quilting, but that's just part of the process. This particular bar here is where you would attach the bottom of the backing of the quilt. So the backing would go under and attach to here as well before we attach the top. This is where the bottom of the top would be attached, if you're attaching it at all. Some people will float a quilt top, and again we'll talk about floating a quilt top when we get to that part of the lecture series. But some people, there's definitely pros and cons for both, and people have very deep-rooted feelings about them. Sometimes for me, I will float a smaller top. If it's a larger quilt top, I usually like to go ahead and connect it to the bottom rail. This is made to pivot up and down. The reason for that is just so you don't stress the fabric, but also I can access the bobbin area if this is up out of the way. If I have a quilt loaded on here and if the bar is down, I wouldn't have access. I'd have to move the machine all the way past the quilt to change the bobbin. And so this is one of the nice things about the machine. And I'll show you the other pin, another feature of this take-up bar. This little post right here helps to disengage the ratchet on the quilt top bar when I raise it into position. Right now, if you can see, the ratchet itself is connected. You can hear it ratcheting. When I go ahead and lift up the whole system here, the little ratchet bar will hit that post and disengage. And now the bar is free. And that allows you to advance the quilt on the system as you're moving to the next position to quilt. So that's a cool little feature on the Bernina frames. I'm not sure which other frames have that. There are also two posts here that help keep the bar from going any further back than they're supposed to. But the Bernina do have these really nice ratchets that allow you to advance the quilt or to tighten it in place as you're quilting. When the dealer came to set up my machine, the machine came in advance of the dealer, and I had brought all the components in. And the dealer came from quite a distance because I don't have a really close local dealer. So he got here late in the afternoon, and we worked on assembling the frame, but we didn't actually finish until the next day. And by the time we were finished, I think we both wanted it to be done, and we rushed a little bit on putting my leaders onto the bar. The leaders all have markings on them, and you do really want that center mark all to be identical for all three components. So I recently took the time to take all of my leaders back off, absolutely measuring the dead center of each bar, making sure that those lined up. And I even marked mine with an additional red line so that when I'm busy, I have just another visual cue of when those are the quilt is lined up. But as you can see, all three of mine, the center marks are lined up perfectly with the leaders. So I know that when I put my center of the top on, it's also going to be the center of the bottom component. If it's twerked a little bit, as you're sewing the quilt, you're going to be getting a distortion as you roll up. And this is just an important key to make sure that those three center marks are all identical. And it's something that you would like to take a little extra time to make sure that you get that correct. So that is something I would really stress about checking. You can even imagine if it were a piece of paper and you had the paper off center and you were rolling it onto two sticks, what a crinkled mess that would make. Now the fabric is flexible, but you're still going to be distorting it as you roll it up. So that was really important, and I'm glad that I went and took the extra time to fix that. So I'm also going to loosen the bolt on this bar and show you how it is possible to slide that on the framing system and what a difference it makes with your sewing space when you get to quilting. So I have loosened two of the bolts on each side of my framing system to prove a point on here. The back of the machine hits the take-up bar, doesn't quite hit the dead bar, but this is as far forward as the machine can go. And as you can see here on the front of the machine, the bobbin area would be hitting the bar that has the quilt back rolled up on it, and it would be a little bit thicker than this with a large quilt rolled on it. So those two things limit the size of the space that I could quilt on. But if I wanted to put my ruler table onto the frame, and you absolutely have to have your ruler table on if you're doing any kind of ruler work. Now I'm about 2.5 inches away. I lose about 2.5 inches up front of my quilting design space. So I've reduced the size of the area that I can quilt in by adding my ruler on here. But that's only if I leave the frame as it was set up. I'm going to just pan over and show you the two screws. there's two screws, one here and one here, and they have those on both sides of the framing system. By loosening those, I'm going to show you how I can move the front of the frame back out. Now I can pull the framing system out as far as I need to allow for that ruler bar to work. Now I have a greater space between my dead bar and the top backing bar for my machine to work. That also means that there's more of the quilt exposed for me to see visually. I wouldn't necessarily be able to quilt all of it, but I would be able to see it, and sometimes that's important when you're doing a quilting design. And it gives me the maximum amount of space, even with my ruler table, to have the motion of the machine. So take a close look at your framing system, even after the dealer sets it up, to make sure that you've maximized your design space. One thing that it's really important to understand when purchasing a Longarm machine is the difference between the size of the head and what you can actually sew. The Bernina Q24 has 24 inches between the back wall and the needle. And if I slide my ruler right underneath the dead bar all the way to the back of the machine, I'm going to pan down, and I apologize for the little grinding noise of the camera. I hope that's clear. You can see the needle falls exactly on 24. So there is 24 inches between the back wall and the needle position, but you're never ever going to be able to sew 24 inches because the back wall hits these two obstacles, and so just with the back wall you come down to 21 inches. So you've lost 3 inches of sewing space just because of the dead bar and the take-up bar. And this is empty. As I load a quilt and I quilt it, and this take-up bar becomes thicker and thicker with batting, backing, and the top, that's going to push the machine even further back, and you're going to continue to lose some sewing space because of that. But these red lines indicate the center of my quilt, and if I measure the system from the back to the front, this position here is dead center, left to right and front to back. And that's really important when we're loading a pantograph in the back, so that we have the pantograph centered where the design space is. If you had the pantograph just loaded at the bottom of the table, a portion of that pantograph would sew out in an area where the head of the machine is hitting your take-up bar. So we're going to go over that again once I have a quilt loaded, and once again when we have the pantograph loaded, just so that you can understand how important it is to get the center marking on the front and the back, just so that you know where that's at. Most machines have a throat space that looks similar to this. The Bernina does have the two sensors on the side here. These are what control the Bernina stitch regulator. So as the fabric moves past these sensors, that's what tells the machine to speed up or slow down. Some machines have wheels on the carriage that gauge movement. I personally think the laser lights right here where the fabric is moving is the most accurate. And this is what a ruler base looks like. This is an additional purchase for most machines, but this is absolutely required if you're going to do any kind of ruler work on your machine, and they're designed specifically to fit the machine you're purchasing. But what they allow you to do is when you have a quilt loaded, to use the machine with the ruler foot and the ruler and the table. It's a 3-part system, very much the same way your cutting mat, rotary cutting ruler, and your rotary cutter work in conjunction. These all work in conjunction, and allows the user to make designs with the ruler that are very accurate. So even if you were doing in the ditch work, you would need a straight edge ruler like this. A lot of them have these notches, which are the exact size of the foot, so that when this is on the edge of the line you're sewing, this indentation allows for the size of the hopping foot to still create a straight line with the design you're following. There are all other different kinds of rulers, curves and circles and points that you can purchase to do other kinds of designs, but I think just even a straight edge stitch in the ditch ruler like this makes the whole system worth having, the table and the ruler. Even if you're doing mostly pantos, sometimes you'll just want to do stitch in the ditch around a block to stabilize it, or the edge of the quilt, or around the inner and outer border. Sometimes all machines come with the handlebars in the front. The Bernina handlebars are completely adjustable up and down, side to side, so it all depends on how you're comfortable sewing. But the Bernina does not come with back handlebars. That's an additional purchase, and that's the case with many machines. They require that you purchase back handlebars and a laser pointer if you're going to be doing pantograph designs, and they usually call it a pantograph kit. It usually includes the back handlebars and the laser light, and I'll show you those on the machine. These are the back handlebars. It also comes with the LCD screen. And also you can see I have the cord here and the laser light. The laser pointer is what you would use to follow a pantograph with. And you can see right now the machine is on, but the screen is not illuminated. And all I have to do is touch any one of the buttons on my machine, and that will pull the control unit back to the back, so the machine now knows that these handlebars are controlling the machine and not the front. Now if I wanted to switch it back to the front, all I have to do is go to the front and touch one of the buttons, and it will switch back there as well. These buttons on here control needle up, needle down, the hopping foot up and down, also the stop and start, and a tie-off function. And you can change those on the screen here, as you can see. That's just the way the Bernina works. Another thing that you might hear about as you're shopping for a machine, or that you may be thinking about, are called channel locks. The channel locks are just little clamps that will lock in place. Now I've just done this one, and this one will allow me to do front to back but not side to side, and some people use those to do straight lines. There's also a channel lock on the side here, and that will lock up. Mine's not clamping in place. That would lock up and allow me to do side to side but not front to back. I don't use my channel locks that often, and it looks like I need to tighten that one because it didn't lock in place. But I'm not going to force it right now. So channel locks are very useful for some people. Some people use them for doing matchstick design over the background of a quilt or something of that nature. But those are also an additional purchase. They don't generally come with the machine unless you're getting some kind of a special purchase price. Also, you can see this does not come with the machine. This is called a Pantograph grids. It's a clear plastic sheeting that has grid work on it. And the Pantograph grids do come in various sizes. I believe there's 3 different sizes for these. The size of that is dependent on the size of your machine and your design area that you could sew. What I use the Pantograph grids for, I would put my pantograph underneath the clear paper, and it allows me to make sure that the pantograph is lined up straight I can edit the two sides of the design without altering my paper, and I can also edit the top and bottom where I might need to make adjustment for the size of the quilt. So this is a single purchase. I would consider it also an essential purchase if you're doing any kind of editing on a pantograph, any kind of pantograph work, or if you wanted to just practice drawing your own design, you could draw it back here and follow it with the pantograph system when you're doing the quilting. It's also a great way of blocking out some area of the quilt that you may not want to sew on, and what we mark on it with are wet erase markers. The marker allows you to see the design that you're the edits that you're doing, but it's not going to rub off on a dry quilt with the dry erase marker. You want to make sure you use the wet so that when you do want to remove it, you'd use a paper towel and just some water or Windex, but it's not going to transfer onto your quilt accidentally as you're loading or offloading your quilt. Another thing that I'm going to point out, I did not just automatically load my pantograph grids, or would I automatically load a pantograph at the bottom of the table, because that's not necessarily the center of where my design space is on the front of the machine. I could put the pantograph down here, but I might lose 5 or 6 inches of design space because the head of the machine just simply can't sew there. So I centered my pantograph grids on the table just as I'm going to center the head of the machine on the front so that they work together in conjunction, and I know that the design is going to allow me to do everything in this area on the front. I might mention that I used some tattoo elements from Urban Elements to decorate my Bernina. Roses always remind me of my mother, so I always like to include those in a design when I can. I also added a couple command performance hooks on the side of my machine here so I can hang my scissors that are out of the way but still very accessible. This is a horizontal thread bar. This was also an additional purchase, and it may be for other machines as well. But when I'm sewing with thread that is wound just horizontally on the spool like a metallic thread, this is how I would want this thread to unspool. The top is great for cross-wound threads, and I've even marked that on my machine where I have the 2 thread holders. So cross-wound thread can go on the top, but the horizontally wound thread is better to come off of this spool holder, and for me it was worth the extra purchase to get that, because when I sew with metallic thread, it's not breaking, it's not kinking as it goes through the system, and it just makes for a lot less stressful quilting when you're using decorative type threads that may be wound straight on the spool. Most domestic sewing machines also have both vertical and horizontal thread spool holders, so it only makes sense that our Longarm machine would have the same. And you can see that right now the LCD screen is not illuminated, but as soon as I touch one of the pieces, one of the buttons, it's going to call the command to the front of the machine, and I can go ahead and get things set up. Another thing I like about the Bernina is that all of the threading is here in the front. I have some tension guides here and here. I can actually thread my machine without even opening this front door, but I've also made myself a couple of notes to check the foot. The Bernina feet do interchange really quickly. They just pop off, but I always like to make sure that I have them attached very well so that they don't come off while I'm actually sewing. So you can see just how easily these feet go back into place, just like a regular Bernina system. And I have a lot of different feet that I can use with the sewing machine. This is a nice thing to look at when you're purchasing a machine, how you go about changing the feet. You don't need any tools to do it here, and so that's really nice. I also have the type of needle system that this machine uses, and also you could on the inside of the door make any other notes, like for monofilament you might want to reduce your thread tension to 175, but you could make little notes the way I've made notes here on the inside of the door where they would be out of view, just to give you another place to have easy access to some of your information. You can of course program different things in the machine. I don't do that. I'd rather just do the settings as I'm loading the thread. Aside from the adjustable handles, one of the other things that I really like about the machine is just how effortless it is to move the machine. I can easily move the machine. It glides beautifully from one end to the other. This allows me to have one hand on the quilt. It allows me to have one hand on a ruler. I can switch the buttons back and forth so that my stop and start is on either one of the handlebars, and allows me to do work on the front of the machine. So that's just one thing. The machine feels very light to the touch. It glides beautifully. But also you would want to take a minute when you get your machine to make sure that the machine is level. When you put it someplace, ideally it should sit in place. Mine is gliding just a little bit, so I need to adjust the feet just a tiny bit. And the reason that that's so important, if I had a quilt loaded and I have my Bernina stitch regulated on, if I didn't shut the machine, the stop button on my sewing, and I let go of the machine and it started to glide, because the fabric is moving past the sensor, it would start sewing again. So you want to make sure that your machine is level when you get it into your studio space. As I said earlier, I use Husky toolboxes to keep my supplies in. I have all of my threads in here, my glide threads in here, and I have my drawers marked. I have isocord thread here with my thread chart. These toolboxes are metal. This one at Home Depot I believe was like $128. So they're pretty reasonable, they're heavy duty, and I just like the way that they're really made a little sturdier. I like this one because I can roll it right next to the machine when I'm loading a quilt. I've got my pins on here. Here I have an old-fashioned external bobbin winder with some of my commonly used threads. The Bernina does have a bobbin winder on it, but I, like many things, I've just gotten used to using the external bobbin winder, and just gives me a break from the machine for a minute when I'm loading up a bobbin. You could obviously load up a couple bobbins at a time and have them ready, just switch them out. But I like the old external bobbin winders, and it just makes for easy transfer of the bobbin when it runs out. I also use a TOA tension gauge on my bobbin from time to time just to make sure that the bobbin tension is not wildly out of proportion, and we can show you that at a later video. Well, we've talked about the basic components of the frame and the machine. Some of these obviously will make a little bit more sense in the preceding weeks, especially next week when we load a quilt onto the frame and show you how that works, and we'll do it one step at a time. If you get a chance, you might want to check out Urban Elementz website. They have over 5,000 pantograph designs, block designs, corner units. They come in both paper and digital, and this paper catalog is available for purchase on their website as well. They're a great resource for some of the things you're going to want and need for your long arm quilting, like the pantograph grids and magic chalk, and a lot of the designs, as well as the applique elements that you see here in the studio. So we look forward to seeing you next week, and thanks for stopping by today.